Thanks for your contributions. Just to pick up, I suppose, first of all, the three of you have spoken twice, and I haven't heard one of you has mentioned anything about the numbers that are dying in Ukraine. I mean, we have these less privileged people who actually didn't start the war, but are dying in it. And I don't know how your industry can be so disconnected from what happens when your equipment is used by either side. The equipment that you make it's designed to kill people, and I don't know what you think about it in those terms. Back in 1960, Eisenhower, when he was leaving the U.S. presidency, he warned America about the developing entity which he described as the military-industrial complex. I think it was the first time the term was used. And this idea that, oh, if you make the stuff, well, you don't necessarily have to use it. Well, that's not actually the way it works, right? If you make it, there's pressure to use it. The Americans spend over $800 billion a year on arms. The Americans have dropped more bombs than the rest of the world put together since 1945. You make it, there's a pressure to use it. Now, you said that it's not a very profitable industry. I beg to differ. There's not many people who agree with you on that. I'd like to compare it against all other industries around the planet. I think the arms industry does really well. And it loves war because you make money from war. If I made raincoats and umbrellas, I couldn't sell them if it didn't rain. And you'd struggle to sell equipment if there was no war. And you're selling it by the bucketful at the moment and looking to produce more and more and more because there's a war going on. It's in your financial interest that there's war. You thrive on it. Why can't you just admit that? Where are we going? This is all madness. You said that multilateralism and dialogue has been weakened. Goddamn right they have. We've refused to engage in dialogue and diplomacy on Ukraine. I'm not excusing the Russians. Putin was completely wrong to invade the place. But we could have tried to stop it harder. We've actually, in April 2022, we stopped peace breaking out. There's too many people, too many elites wanting the war to continue, and you're part of it. Your industry doesn't want the war to stop because you make less money. The Americans and NATO don't want the war to stop. This is a mad show. And there's, as my colleague said, we have a housing crisis in most countries in Europe. People are waiting too long to get a medical appointment. Healthcare is unaffordable for so many people. Social services are getting weaker, and we can't spend enough money on military, and we don't give a damn about the hundreds of thousands dying in Ukraine? How do you sleep at night?
Mike, our committee's title is Security and Defense, not a war committee. It's not a war committee. We're not making wars. I mean, we're not initiating. I mean, we're not bringing people one against another. And look at the President Zelensky. Does he want a war? I don't grab it. I mean, once he taking a floor and speaking on behalf of his people. But it's a serious issue. Colleagues, we have many questions. And there is a certain limit of time. May I ask all the speakers to be within the 3 minutes time frame, replying to many and interesting questions. And may I ask to begin in a reverse order, starting from Dr. Dero Sudaru. Oh, no. Clermont. Excuse me. That's right, Mr. Clermont.
Merci.
Thank you. The questions. Firstly, Mr. Gala's, yes, of course, we need long-term planning to benefit from the imagination needed, the nimble work required in industry to come up with solutions and then manufacture those solutions sustainably rather than having tools that have to be dismantled at some point. Yes, we are looking at long-term planning. We in the industry are part of programmes funded by the European Defence Fund, and we do have calls under European procurement programmes. We don't have examples yet of more complex equipment such as armed vehicles or other types of equipment that will be needed but have not yet been identified as urgent. We are upgrading equipment that had been stockpiled in warehouses, getting that equipment operational. Up until recently, we had not been looking at combat readiness, operational urgency. We'd been looking at having equipment in place for armies to maintain their capabilities in line with the needs of the time, and those needs have changed. I would agree with Ms. Yoncheva on getting small industrial players involved. Let me highlight one point clearly. We do rely on large orders from large European countries. We are suppliers, not partners in developing solutions. We are suppliers. We compete with other suppliers. And that creates some uncertainty for small players. Yes, we need to look at structural options, look at co-development rather than the supply chain in the conventional sense, with design authorities then looking for the best suppliers for their systems, in other words, the best value. That's what I wanted to say by way of response. We in the industry are keen to see diversification. We all have quite extraordinary solutions available, and I think it is worth exploring all those solutions and enhancing visibility to promote cooperation when it comes to supplying a whole diverse range of solutions.
Oui, Monsieur Geller, donc je voudrais répondre à votre question.
Thank you. Mr. Giller, I'd like to reply to your question on the EDIRPA tool, which has stimulated grouped orders between European countries in a quite reactive way. It's a limited budget, but allows us to trial the system, so that's a positive. Obviously, we have to be sure that if we extend this tool, that we focus on the real priorities. The advantage of a system is that's quite simple, so it's a process that reduces the administrative burden, and that's important too in terms of stimulating the response to that kind of order. And then you have to check that there's a good fit between the government dimension and the community dimension, because it's an order by state, so you have to find the right machinery so that it becomes effective. So that said, EDIRPA is a good initiative. You see it with the example of Mistral, and we hope to be able to reproduce it. Now, it takes time, years. This war could go on for decades, so we have to project into the future and look at the tools that will endure in time to prolong the effort. For Madame Yoncheva, that's something, it's very important to take account of all the SMEs We have 1,600 subcontractors at our firm, both French and European, through programs that are funded by the European Defence Fund. The EDIS2 program, for example, is a very important one for European sovereignty, which is a ballistic hyperspeed missile interceptor, so it's for the decades to come. But we've about 50 different companies around 14 European countries that are involved. And I Chair, your question on cooperation with Ukraine. These missiles are very complex, so we don't have industrial cooperation as such, but there are seminars that are being planned in Ukraine today to see how we can improve cooperation in that regard. But the fact that we've been able to adapt to our missiles to Ukrainian planes is something that's not necessarily done with industry, but with the French armed forces. And the question, Mr. Wallace's question, I think you have no idea to what extent all Europeans are against the war. We're well aware of the thousands of deaths that you speak of. And in my company, we're not warmongers. We would all like to see peace. So we're not lapping up contracts because of the war in Ukraine, far from it. So that's why I said that I wanted to serve in the defense industry like soldiers serve, and all the soldiers are against war. When you're for a life, you're against war, and when you've lived through war, you know how awful it is. But unfortunately, war exists. There will be other wars. We dreamt for years that we have an era of peace, and that was the base of European construction. Nonetheless, war has come upon us, and we're the first in line speaking out against war, whatever you might think.
Ce que je voudrais peut-être juste rajouter, j'en profite.
I would just like take the opportunity to make one last point, which is about the ESG initiatives of taxonomy. Now, if we point the finger at the defense industry as being an industry of evil, then we weaken this European defense industry, and we need, as we've said, the human resources. Mr. Donjon and Mr. Gala said that we need talented people who are educated, who are measured to work in this specific sector of the defense industry. It's not just in the big groups, but also in the SMEs that we have the dual civil military use, and who often are have their finger pointed at them, but they serve the defense of European component. So it's important to promote this defense industry, its ethical values, which are at the service of the defense of our countries.
Dr. Beru-Sudru for a final.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I'll try to address some of the questions, not all of them. I think to respond to one of Mr. Geller's remarks on, inviting the industry to be more courageous and invest, knowing that the demand will be there. I mean, I was also, working on this assumption, but realizing that actually the size of one thing is the size of the demand, but what exactly will the demand will be? If you see that, different systems cannot switch ammunitions because of different calibers, etc. I think for a company it's very difficult unless you know exactly what will be that demand to make those investments by itself. So, I don't really have a solution yet to sort of this chicken and egg dilemma, but I think it's really something to focus on, and maybe discussing on, standardization, certification might be one way to solve this issue. On the question of Mrs. Yoncheva on the importance of SMEs, like the other speakers, I totally agree. And I think to me it's also one of the ways to solve that dilemma I was mentioning earlier in my introduction remarks, that it's a way to make sure that the smaller defense industries, that there's an interest to buy in and to procure from the European industry if the local arms industry is involved. And you can really see that discrepancy between the bigger member states where companies make millions or billions of revenue in defense, whereas the bigger companies in smaller countries, it's only 1 million or even less in defense revenue. So to make sure that there's this interest for non-LOI countries, for smaller countries, to get involved in defense and to buy from the EU industry, that their local companies are also involved in those programs. And so strengthening the EDF and potentially looking for EDIP, that making sure that different countries and companies from different countries work together is really key. And I think also just addressing Mr. Wallace's remarks, if you see, post-Cold War, what has been called the peace dividends, the military expenditure has been going down in Europe, in the US, to some extent. The military spending was going down. And that's because it was at the times when I think threat perceptions were not as high. But unfortunately, we're living in a world now where threat perceptions are quite high, where, we as Europeans, we live next to Russia, which has proven to be a major threat. And the people dying in Ukraine you've been mentioning, of course, I think that's the whole thing. We want to protect them and do the best we can to protect them. And that, for the time being, that is through, helping them defend themselves with weapon systems. So that will be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you.